Okay, well, welcome. It is March. Spring is almost here. And it's warming up slowly, so hopefully everybody's doing well. Again, my name is Pheng, he and his pronouns, with the Men Masculine Folks Network, and coming to you live, as always, every other Thursday at the kitchen table, or what we would want to be known as the kitchen table, to really have conversations with all of you and all of us who are here present in this moment on current events and topics and issues that men and masculine folks are navigating and practicing in terms of healthy masculinity, what that means for their own lives and the relationships that they have with other people. So just wanted to briefly share that. And today is going to be such an intimate conversation between me and my good and esteemed colleague here, and I'll let them introduce themselves here.
Thank you, esteemed colleague. My name is Sean Hayes. My pronouns are he, him, and his. Excited for our intimate conversation. And yeah, I'm in Duluth, Minnesota, where it is sunny. And I am looking forward to some of this ice and snow melting because it's difficult to traverse around here.
Right. And can't wait. I always think that it's going to get warmer and it'll be better, but we've been having a pretty good winter, I should say, right? And it hasn't been too bad so far, so let's hope it keeps up that way and that spring comes by the end of the month. Sunday is spring forward, so make sure you turn your clocks forward 1 hour, if you remember, at like 2 o'clock or whatever, so it goes to 3 o'clock if I'm not mistaken. So spring is spring forward and fall is fall back an hour. That's how you remember the time change. I think there's only, like, fun fact is that I think there's only like 1 or 2 states that don't change time. Right, Sean, if you know, I think Arizona being one of them that doesn't change time. And I think there's another state, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong as well too. But just a fun little fact, and nobody had already known that and seen that. Today, we really wanted to, for our 38th conversation here, obviously it being March, for those of you who don't already know, yesterday or the day before yesterday, I should say, was recognized and is recognized throughout the world as International Women's Day, on top of it being Women's History Month for March as well too, right, here in the US. And so there's globally, on Tuesday, there was a lot of property events and things like that happening globally. If you pay attention to global events and stuff like that in local communities and with folks celebrating and talking about and valuing and honoring that women and girls and femme folks in their lives. And so we really wanted to give honor and thanks and really celebrate Women's History Month on top of International Women's Day that just happened on Tuesday as well too. We know that some of our organization was off, and some other organizations and sister and partner agencies were off that day as well too, and the importance of that in our work, right? And what it means to be practicing healthy masculinity in recognition of Women's History Month. And so I think that for our 38th and intimate conversation today between Sean and myself is really to think about what that means, what that looks like for us as male-identified people who are practicing healthy masculinity and manhood in the context of honoring girls and femme folks in our lives. Right? So I leave it there and see where the conversation goes for us.
Yeah, I know for me, on Tuesday, International Women's Day, like you said, we have that day off as one of our, paid holidays. And I've always kind of liked that about Men as Peacemakers, where they sort of try to look at these holidays and culturally and within the work that we do, honoring women, and having that day off is really cool. And also, I definitely had some odd feelings that day as well because I'm still working remotely here with my wife, Amy, who also is, remotely working. And so I had the day off and she didn't. And so I was having some interesting feelings about that. I did apologize to her at one point. I'm like, I kind of feel bad that I'm a dude and I have this day off and you're here, having to do your job, regularly. But um yeah, so that was interesting to me to kind of think about that and like the privilege I think that, the men and masculine folks who have that day off um kind of get to take part in that, um and also one of the things that I was seeing a lot of, especially on Tuesday, but throughout, the start of March, as folks and organizations and people are talking about Women's History Month, one of the common themes that I have seen is where folks are really trying to make the point of who, who are we including within Women's History Month? How do we define womanhood? Who fits within that? And a lot of these posts I've seen, are trying to reiterate that trans women are women, and so we include trans women, femme folks, as you mentioned earlier, Pheng, and even I think non-binary and gender non-conforming folks, can also fit within this. So it's interesting. I think that part of the conversation is interesting because I think the more inclusive that can be of all women and folks who identify as female or feminine, I feel like that is great to move towards more inclusivity, and also, holding that there may also be some women out there who are like, that is sort of taking away from my womanhood. I sort of hear that argument a lot. And obviously, as a guy, it feels a little odd to talk about that, right? Because I don't identify in that way. And so what say should I have, right? Um, but yeah, I think that that's a really interesting place that I think feminism and the movement and the work that we're doing, has been shifting and transforming sort of in that direction. So I'm curious what you think about that, Pheng, or how you think about it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that appreciations to you lifting up all those nuances and the kinds of conversations that are happening in community or that have been happening over the years and centuries, right? In terms of what and who is a woman. And I think that in light of our conversation during Black History Month and during the passing of Bell Hooks and their book and the way in which they talk about them being seen as a woman and as a Black woman too, right? In this country, I think that they really questioned that that place of that intersection between race and gender and what that meant for their identity and who they are, or what it didn't mean for them, and what then they and how then they became less than or invisibilized in the context of this other narrative of what it means to actually be a woman in this country, right? And in our local communities at the same time too. So it brings me to that place when you were sharing. And then I think the other part that you were sharing that I was really reflecting on is the day, International Women's Day, and having it off for me was really a place of I think being able to reflect and being able to actually stop and being able to celebrate and being able to actually just be in relationship with the women and girls and femme folks that have been in my life and really think about those relationships and what that means to me as I practice healthy masculinity and continue to practice what it means to be a man in ways that are not going to be harmful or causing harm to those who are around me. So I think about that. That is what it, to me, what it meant to me for having that day off, right? And then I think about I was watching on YouTube, because so many people have YouTube channels nowadays. And it's interesting to see some of the Hmong folks in Laos and Thailand and elsewhere talk about that day and celebrating it, right? And whether they have a full in-depth understanding of it or not, or whether they have a subliminal understanding of it or not, it's just really um, positive, if I could use that word, and affirming and encouraging to be able to actually see them really pause in that day and in that moment and really do like family gatherings to get together is really celebrate the women and girls in their lives and the family people in their lives and really bestow a lot of like affirmation and positivity and care and concern for the well-being of the people that they're in relationship with, particularly the husbands or the partners or the friends, you know, the male friends, being able to do those things. And so I think about that, and I know that even at the United Nations level and place, which I think only in the context of the US that we don't talk about that a lot, but in my travels across the world and around the world to different places in the country, United Nations actually holds a really dear place to those countries, right? And particularly to the women folks that I've met along that journey, about them talking about equity and equality for them and what that means, right? And having the United Nations actually have an office on the status or on I think it's called the status of women and girls or something like that, but really on equity, right? And really pushing equity, not only just in one country, but in all the countries throughout the world. And I think that that's how they got to the place of creating a day, what was it? March 8th, March 7th. March 7th being, and March 8th, I should say, being International Women's Day, and that day being recognized in that way. And so I think if we look at it in the context of the US and locally in Minnesota and where we are, we know that there's still inequities happening and there's still violence that is happening. So that's a signifier that women and girls and femme folks are not yet seen as valuable assets in our communities and the contributions that they make. I do know that the Women's Foundation of Minnesota puts out a report on the status of women and girls every year. And I know that they're putting one out soon here in a couple of days, if I'm not mistaken, either next week or the week after that, on what's actually happening and how women and girls and femme folks are doing, mostly women and girls, how they're doing in Minnesota and how they're faring in Minnesota, especially women and girls of color, right? And how they're doing their well-being and their lives and statuses. To your point about the inclusion of femme folks and female identified folks from the LGBTQ and queer and gender nonconforming community who have those expressions or those identities within themselves or a part of who they are. I think it's important, right? It is important that we not only think about what do I want to say, these qualities or characteristics that are associated to feminine features or female people, folks, as a monolith to just one specific and one type of identity or one frame of way of being, right? I think that becomes really exclusive and excluding when we think of it in that way, right? And when we only have narratives that support, like people's stories and people's lives that support that idea and that frame only, and that is what only constitutes. But I believe in the diversity of our um, lives and our identities and the ways in which we interact and in people, that we have to be able to actually see the vastness and the array of diversity, even within femininity, even within what it means to be femme, even within what it means to be female, and be able to actually like open the doors to being able to see all of that, right? And the relevance and all of that. Because what we know is that it may not happen here, but around the world, what we do know that the notions of why the violence happens towards female identified folks and femme folks is because they are not playing or behaving the part of that idea or that notion, that one notion or that one idea of what it means to be woman, right? And so therefore they experience the violence because of that, right? So that sort of like, and I understand that there's maybe perhaps some concern or need or desire to want uniformity or conformity. And I think that there can be, even in diversity, there can be uniformity and diversity or conformity, right? So even in diversity, you can see that and you can experience that as well too. And that everybody does not actually have to be the same. It's the same as like you know, I have two boys and they have very different ways of behaving and relating to the world. They're not relating to the world the same way. It's quite opposite of each other, actually. But just some of the things that I'm thinking about that I wanted to share as you were sharing.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was heating up my coffee before we went live was just, you know, this conversation and thinking about, you know, the person that I am, the human that I am at this moment is really thanks primarily to women and femme folks in my life too. And thinking about the huge role that these folks have played, you know, in sharing their stories and sharing their experiences with me, so that I can sort of grow how I show up as a man, as a masculine person for our women folk. And also just like all of the ways that they sort of see, I think that they are, I don't know if attuned is right, if that's the right word, but like oftentimes the women folks in my life are the ones who are pointing out like that was a toxic thing that you did there, or like, you know, they will see these things and then because we have this relationship then they can come to me and like hold me accountable, um and then I get that opportunity to like share those learnings, you know, with the people who I interact with. And so that was one thing that I was just like, I was just thinking about the countless women and femme folks who, even in the last year, right? But then thinking about the entirety of my life. So that was something that was coming up that I just wanted to like put out there because I think, you know, it's like many of these days, right? Where it's like we have one day or one month out of a year where we recognize folks, and we want to uplift those folks. And it's just, it's never enough, right? But just that, I think what you shared about taking that time to do the reflection as a masculine person on those days, that feels like a, I don't know. It needs to be happening daily, right? Like those reflections and you know, the reminder that like we as men and masculine folks can continue and need to continue every day, you know, fighting the patriarchy that is within us. I think oftentimes we think about patriarchy being like this thing that's like outside of us that we're trying to fight against, and change or destroy. You know, some people might say destroy that, you know, and but I think a lot of it lives within us, you know, because of the society that we grow up in. And And then the other piece, I think, of what you shared there too is like I was having a moment where I was realizing, wow, my thinking even felt really, really small in terms of who I was thinking about. I was thinking about all of these folks mainly within the US and close by me, right, in Minnesota or Wisconsin. And so like that global piece that you brought in is something, and you even said like that's not something that we in the US really focus a lot or talk about a lot. But I was thinking about that, like, gosh, I really don't know what the experiences are like for women, girls, femme folks outside of the US. And I have, like, a glimpse of what it's like here within the States as well, just from these folks that I shared, who have taken the time to share their experiences and harm they've experienced and those things within this country. So it's just like ever expanding, right? Like my
Mhm.
brain and I think that never would have been on my mind had you not brought it up, right, in this conversation. So thank you for that, because I think what you were sharing about like how femininity can be so expansive and it can be defined in so many different ways and by each individual person. Um, and so I love that because I agree. Like I think that the more expansive that we can be as we're sort of trying to define these things, I think that that
Mhm.
is just better in the long run. Um, and it feels like there are less limits, right? Like we don't have to actually follow these rules that society has like created for feminine folks. Like we can actually expand beyond that, and that feels really exciting to me.
Mhm. Mhm. That's true. Um, I think that that's where to some of what you shared there. I think what it does is um, when we can move beyond, if we can, our peripheral ways of being in relationship with people, like not just our immediate folks that we're constantly in relationship with, um, but move into spheres and spaces where we may not be typically and normally, and being able to actually like open ourselves up in that way to be vulnerable and yet to be experiencing, right? To not be vulnerable and I shouldn't say that, let me say that, to be vulnerable and to experience, and to not say I need someone from that place or space to be the one that's guiding me through it. I think that that's necessary, but it isn't needed all the time, right? Because then the way in which I may experience that space or that community or those folks and be engaging in relationship with those folks then becomes complacent in a safe container because of that interaction or because of that relationship that I have with a certain individuals from that space or place or community. So when you were talking, Sean, I was like thinking about like how do we then move and break barriers within ourselves as we practice healthy masculinity. And it was very funny because I had this video popped up on my YouTube as I was watching YouTube. It was a language video by Phoenix Who, Hou, if I'm pronouncing his last name right. And he said in this video, he titled it, Learning Languages Ruined My Life. But it wasn't really, I don't know why he titled it that way, but the way in which he spoke about languages, because he speaks like 10 or something, many dialects or many languages, I should say. And what he said that I thought was pretty profound to what you shared there, I'm going to see, oh, he said, after learning a language, a part of you becomes a member of the tribe to which the language belongs to. After learning a language, a part of you becomes a member of the tribe to which the language belongs to. And I thought that that was like such, and that was Phoenix Who again, HOU. That was such a fascinating quote that he had shared. And I think about that with regards to what you were sharing in terms of like um, deepening and widening your understanding of the context of women and girls and femme folks globally, like in a global sense, right? So much of our conversations, I think, at this table, come at this kitchen table, and for the last 2 years or so, has really been focused and narrowed in on like the context of Minnesota and living here in Minnesota. And yet we understand that our lives in Minnesota, as much as it can be very siloed, and as much as it can be orientated to the geographic location of where we are in the state and how we relate to one another, we know that our lives at the same time to Menace Peacemaker's value of connecting in community and being connected in community means that we are a smaller part of a bigger ecosystem, right? A smaller microscopic piece of a larger functioning world globally, right? And it means that the way in which we understand some of the things and some of these issues to what you and I are talking about here today with regards to women and girls and their lived experiences, it could look vastly different in other places and in other countries, right? And the way in which folks may think about what it means to be a woman and a girl, they may have different definitions and different terms to be able to describe those characteristics or that identity or those identities, right? As well too. And then we also have like here and there pockets, I think throughout the world, where there is like matrilineal and matriarchal societies or communities, right? Who then define and may define femininity and being a woman in a very different way, with very different characteristics than the way in which we and those of us who live in more patriarchal communities and societies think about femininity and what it means. So I think the vastness is so like big and broad, and the depth of it is ever changing. And I don't think that, I think that there is a depth to it, but yet I think that it's like sort of a constant depth. You know, like when you think about outer space of like, it just doesn't end. You thought that you were at the end of the horizon or whatever, but you get there and it's like, oh, there's still actually a vastness that's still open. And I would like to think about that as we are reflecting on not only women and girls and femme folks, but on the idea of femininity and on the expression of what it means to be feminine, is that there's just this vastness and openness of what it means and how we describe it and all those things. And that we cannot be the ones to judge or to police each other on those ways of being. It is incumbent on the individual person to define it for us and to define it for themselves, right? And again, I think partially part of that is because we know what happens when others start defining it for us and start trying to control it for us. None of us want that. None of us want others to control our lives. And so therefore, can we allow for spaciousness in that for people to self-define?
Yeah, I love that self-defining. That feels so, I don't know, that feels really good to me, you know, when I think about my own masculinity and how I show up in the world, and thinking about, you know, the ways in which I was raised and grew up thinking about what it means to be a woman and how, you know, we define womanhood just based on like our, our family history and our cultures and all of these different things, right, that play a role in that. And yet, yeah, it's just like how do we shift that conversation from, like, this is my experience as a woman, for example, versus, I have this different experience, like I think about like the constant debate that we hear from trans exclusionary radical feminists about, transgender women are not women and, should not be included in womanhood and femininity. And um, it's like, how does that take away, like, I don't understand how that feels like it takes away from someone else's experience, to know that there are others out there who have different experiences, right? Like, there are common shared experiences, I'm sure, experiencing misogyny and patriarchy and fear of violence, right? Like, I mean, we know that trans women, especially Black trans women, it's literally an epidemic of people being killed violently. And so that fear of navigating the world as a woman, as someone seen femininely, I think that those are very shared experiences. And yet, when you try to sort of define and label and box people into these sort of definitions of femininity, I think it just feels very, I don't know, imprisoning. I don't even know if that's a word, but because I think about when each of us are born and like raised in, at least, my experience in the US, raised in this society, a patriarchal society, it's like we're taught so young, like what is okay for girls to do and what is okay for boys. And I don't think many of us actually take a lot of time, unless we're, somehow doing this kind of work around gender, around ending violence, to think about like that expansive, like, definition of womanhood. Like, it's so easy for people to just like go with what that status quo is of, women should be at home, women should be raising children, all of these things, which of course, like, women can be doing those things. And I support and love people who choose to do that. And I think that that's one way to express and to navigate the world as a woman. And so, yeah, I just think that the more stories I hear, the bigger that notion, I mean, of gender in general, that it really becomes. Like, I like how you were describing it as like outer space, like you're sort of within this like galaxy that we sort of know something about, but not much. And yet then there's all of this other space out there that we have no clue about. And I was just watching Independence Day last night, so I've got aliens on the brain. But it also reminds me of a podcast that I heard, that I listened to recently, with it's from a podcast through Translash, and Amara Jones is the host of this podcast, and she was interviewing, oh goodness, I'm not going to be able to think of her name right now, but they were talking about Marsha P. Johnson, who is a Black trans woman, who lived back in, the 50s, 60s area, very well known for being a part of the Stonewall revolution that happened there in 69, I believe. And so they were talking about Marsha P. Johnson and how she even like talked about this sort of future safe community, that we're all wanting to see and working and building towards. And she also described it as like being like outer space and like wanting to go to this different planet to create these bigger, broader ways in which we show up within gender or without gender. And so that's interesting. I mean, I've got this expansive thing on my brain, and so it's cool that you brought that up.
That's so awesome. That in some ways we are probably in sync with one another. That's what it's probably signifying. That's what I would want to say is the in syncness. in synchronicity of how we perhaps are moving and thinking. Um, I was thinking when you were sharing there is that when you were saying restrictive, and I think that that is so true, right? When it becomes, when we define femininity or uh, masculinity, as I did in a very narrow way, it becomes constricting to the who and to what can be a part of that, right? And it sets up like uh, it sets it up as a specialty, or it sets it up as a, excuse me, um, prestigious club of like how one should be behaving or acting. And I would like to think that we are and we can be in a place where we could say, hey, here are some things of what masculinity or manhood could mean. But it is not limited to those things only, right? And it could be more than that or less than that. And that is where the leeway of people's discretion and people's choice making can actually happen. And people defining it for themselves as well too, right? And what that means to them and in their lives and their experiences of who they are. And I would like to think that thus far, even in our conversations of what it means to practice healthy masculinity and in these kitchen table conversations, that we have yet to fully define and to say, this is what healthy masculinity means, right? Because exactly of the vastness that you and I are talking about here. Because we know that there are practices and there are ways of behaving and moving that are not in alignment to what it means to be healthy. And we can define that and we can share that, right? And then we can imagine what is possible for masculinity. We can imagine what is possible for femininity and honoring what it means to be women and girls and femme folks and femininity beyond what we know is not actually going to be healthy, right? That imagination and that possibility, I think, allows us to grow, allows us to move. It allows us to be in relationship with other people and other folks. It allows us to connect in community. It allows us to open rich dialogues, right? It allows us to be challenged and to be pushed as well too, right? And I think that that's like part of perhaps maybe the experience of life, right? Is to grow and to learn and to shape and be shaped and to be challenged and to challenge others as well too. And it is in that kind of a dichotomy that we move to understand what it means to be healthy in all of the ways that we can be, right? Not just in practicing healthy behaviors, but in our own wellness of our spirit, of our soul, of our own well-being, physiological pieces, our spiritual pieces, our psychological pieces, our physical pieces as well too, parts of who we are. And I think this now can move into this really like, I don't want to say fluffy, but into this very abstract thought and idea, and it's no longer tangible or related to that of what we're talking about at the beginning with regards to women and girls and honoring their sense of who they are and what they've given. And yet I think it also ties in directly with it because it moves us back to perhaps the humanity piece of who we are. And it grounds us in that, and it centers us in that humanity part of it, of us as human beings and our experiences and our life, right? And so I think it goes and it moves us into that nature piece of the stillness and the silence and the observation of human behavior and movement. So I think about, like, years ago, I think it was National Geographic, Sean, was doing all these series like the Blue Planet, and then they did a series called something, and it was just observing in nature, right? How animals or how nature was moving. And I think that there's a lot of beauty in those captured that they did if you watch any of those series. But there's like a lot of beauty, and then there's a lot of like joy, and then there's a lot of like hardships and challenges in it as well. And yet I find it to be grounding, and I find it to be not only boldly beautiful and energetic, but also like just so vast and profound in the experiences of the photographer who's just really videography or taping or observing nature in the way things in nature move. And I think that to us, even in this conversation, is to be able to see that kind of boldness and that kind of beauty in femininity, and to be able to see the challenges in femininity as well too, and then to imagine what we probably may not have thought about, for that it could be very possible for femininity and for womanhood and for girls and for femme folks. Yeah, so I think about those possibilities, and the possibilities in those opportunities. Yeah, so I'm just thinking about that, as to this idea of vastness that you and I are talking about here.
Yeah, and I like how you talked about observing rather than like sort of inserting ourselves into that place. Because what that makes me think about is like all of the men and masculine people through history who have done most of the talking and defining of femininity and womanhood, and the ways that women and girls and femme folks should be showing up in our communities. And I mean, I even think about like politicians today who are talking about how they need to like take back or like reclaim masculinity and femininity in sort of these traditional ways that who are they traditional to, right? So I mean, primarily white Christian folks, I think, throughout the years, and other cultures too, I'm sure, have some of those traits as well. But just the idea of, like, for example, me coming in and trying to tell Amy, well, I think this is how you should show up in our relationship. This is how femininity on you should look. It's just like preposterous, right? She would probably just like slap me, which she should. Well, I shouldn't say that. Not, she wouldn't physically, but she would give me a piece of her mind, probably a big piece of her mind, which she should. And so that's sort of what I was thinking about too, as you were sharing. It's like this, femininity, womanhood. It is like this vast, amazing, beautiful thing. And then for us to want to like come in and insert ourselves, whether we're, men and masculine folks who really have no place in my mind, at least at this moment, of saying, well, this is what it is. These are the definitions. But even I think, other women and femme folks, like we're talking about, will sort of try to say, well, this is the version of, this is the only version of womanhood that's acceptable here. And I just think, getting back to what you said of like, if we can get back to that first, like humanity part of like who we are, removing everybody else's expectations of how we should or need to show up, and then actually get the time and the space to do that reflection and observe. And I think about it for myself. Like for many years, I was just trying to fit into sort of that status quo of masculinity. And gosh, it's just like, I don't know. That's not, the masculinity that this society upholds and centers and, defines. That doesn't fit for me. And so I was thinking about earlier, like, how would I define my masculinity? Like, is it like I'm like trying to go for a more feminine masculinity, or but even like saying that, it's like, well, that doesn't actually, like, what is feminine, what is masculine, and how do I define that for myself, without then sort of taking what I have decided fits for me and like putting that on anyone else, right? Like it's for each of us to come to that place, in our search for our own identities, I think. And so, thinking about all of the different women folk and girls and femme folks that I know, it's like all of them take up space in our communities and bring so many different qualities and skills and creativity and imagination and just like all of these things. And so I think, gosh, it makes me think about toxic masculinity and how we're like, nothing feminine can be near us or touching us. We can't have any of those qualities. And yet I find myself more and more sort of identifying and like drawing closer to some of those feminine qualities, which I think are like, if we took it out of the context of this patriarchal society, like feeling emotions and talking about emotions and some of those things, like they just seem like they're healthy human traits. They're not actually like feminine traits. They're things that we all should be sort of working towards and wanting to be more like.
Yeah, that's so true. I think that there is this like perhaps tension place or this contradiction or paradox place of wanting like some uniformity and then wanting some like differences at the same time too, right? And it's like it ebbs and flow. I think even in this conversation too, is that it's so nuanced, right? It's so nuanced, and I think that perhaps that is actually the groundedness and the beauty of what it means for us as people to be in relationships and to be connected in community, and that life is actually really easy, and it can be easy, and it can be very complicated and sophisticated, and it could be really like challenging at the same time too, and that we move in all of those pieces, right? And so when we think about being in relationship with one another and being connected, particularly to the issue of woman and womanhood and femininity, we do have to ask ourselves as we practice healthy masculinity, what is our relationship to that of femininity? How do we relate to them? And I think that you're talking about that a lot in terms of like, I find myself being drawn to that, right? And thinking that each one of us, not just only woman identified people who self-identify themselves as women, can self-proclaim or can proclaim feminine qualities and expressions only. And that all of us, I think as peoples and as individuals, can claim that as well too, if we want to claim that. because we do have to think about what is our relationship to masculinity. Just because I am born or seen or identified to be male or masculine, or manful, I therefore don't have to question my relationship to masculinity, right? I do have to question, and I do have to look at that, and I do have to understand what that relationship is. Um, and and so I think that even in celebrating, honoring women folks for this month, it also means that we have to question, as masculine identified people, our relationship to femininity and what that means, right? Not just only to the people who we have relationship with who are identified as women, but to that of those characteristics and that expression or those expressions, um, and what it means to us, and how we to ourselves may be expressing ourselves in those ways as well too, or not. And I think that that's why it's hard to sort of regulate or police um, the way in which people move and go about expressing who they are, right? And it doesn't mean like it's a free for all, like you just expressing yourself however you want to express yourself, right? Um, Obviously, there's always limitations and boundaries to everything in life, uh, and yet there has to be some vastness and spaciousness of allowing people that ability to do so as well too, right? And so I think that again, even to that point, it goes into like what do we constrict and then what do we expand, and it's this like constant like, like you're blowing a balloon and you're like contracting and then expanding, contracting and expanding of moving in life. And it's not ever like a just constricting a person's life, because it can be suffocating and it can be really restrictive to your point, where we know that it could have negative impacts on people's lives and who they are. And we've seen that with girls harming themselves because of their identities or who they are or the violence that they've experienced, or feminine folks not being seen as woman enough or whatnot and committing suicide, right, and self-harm as well too. So we do know that it does impact people both psychologically, socially, and emotionally, and spiritually as well too, because when they are confined in one certain way. Right?
I also am thinking about this piece, and this piece around folks who are gender nonconforming and non-binary, and it's like a wondering I have. And as someone who is transgender, I don't know all of the answers about being transgender or being gender nonconforming or non-binary, because I don't identify as those identities. And yet, yeah, I wonder how those folks and like my friends feel about that day, because I think there are, there's so many ways that we do separate and categorize in our world. And when you are outside of those boxes constantly, it just makes me wonder about, um, yeah, like what that day feels like for non-binary folks. And so that's just like a question. I don't know if there's, an answer that we could come up with, because we don't identify that way, and don't experience the world that way. And so that is something that I'm like taking with me to like ask some of my friends, like, what was that day like for you? And how does it feel, when these days are so like categorized? And, like, I think, is there also like there's probably a men's day or something too, not that we need that, but like Mother's Day, Father's Day, other examples, right, of like how it's like this binary. And so, and even thinking of like two-spirit folks and other folks from other cultures who, you know, define their identity outside of that very westernized binary that we've created. So that was just another thing that I was thinking, and I was like, maybe I shouldn't bring that up, but like, because I don't have much good stuff to say about it. But also, it's like that's part of my wondering, and I think that's part of like these conversations that like
Yeah.
we can actually bring those questions forward. And for me, you know, I'm really grateful that I have some of those folks in my life who are close to me that I could actually then go after this and have another conversation, you know, and continue the conversations.
Yeah, I think that that is in the figuring it out, and I think that that is in the ability to be able to, like we've constantly shared on this platform, is to have spaces like this where we can figure out how we move and what questions we ask and where do we ask those questions and what am I thinking? Because it is all in the navigation of what it means to be healthy. It is all in the navigation, I think, of practicing healthy masculinity, that we get spaces and outlets like this platform to be able to have these kinds of robust, transparent, and honest and disagreeing conversations, right? We don't always all align all the time, same wise. We may come close to one another about there's like divergence even in the conversation that you and I had today alone, right, in this intimate way. And so I am reminded to your point there of spaces like this and appreciating this and hoping that those of you who join us here during this hour or thereafter think about how you can create these kinds of spaces and places in your own lives where you can figure these things out as men and masculine folks with other men and masculine folks that you are in relationship with, and having these kinds of conversations or similar conversations to whatever you're thinking about in your head, right, or in your heart or in your body. Because even in that alone is could be a way of healthily being healthy to express your identity and who you are, and honoring those who are around you as well too. So always appreciative of this conversation and really appreciate where and how this conversation ebbed and flowed, Sean, and for being able to spark me and move me as well too. So I appreciate you for that.
Yeah, and right back at you. I think, you know, it's like, it's so cool within these conversations because, you know, like you and I, and even the other guys who aren't here, you know, we all have such unique and different experiences. And so, like, you know, thinking back to like bringing up the global perspective, and it's like, oh, of course, like you know, that's not something that I have not traveled abroad very much. And so, yeah, I think it's like, when we're in these spaces and people are actually able to share from their own experience and to ask the questions, and I just think it's such an opportunity for anyone, you know, who's listening and observing, maybe, you know, in a conversation, to actually expand our understanding and to continue growing. I think, you know, like you mentioned, I think I'm constantly thinking about how I can grow and do better and show up in a more healthy, you know, positive way, whether that's here in my family or within the work that I do or community, you know, broadly speaking. And yeah, so I'm grateful to you, Peng, and for all the other folks who were able to join us today for this intimate conversation, and just really wanting to again offer gratitude and to say that we celebrate womanhood and femininity hood, and how else, you know, what other words that folks use to describe that, right? If you are a woman, if you identify any way, on that femme spectrum, I think we just really want to lift you up, and I want to encourage folks, including myself, to continue. We have a lot of March left, and so we can actually be intentional and take the time to learn about women, whether that's building those relationships nearby and just talking with the women who are in our lives, or whether that's checking out our social media and seeing like who are the voices that we're seeing. Can we add in more Black women, or like just getting these different experiences, right? Because again, we're never going to actually be able to learn about this vastness unless we're hearing those stories and actually like being a part, like that's a part of our everyday. And so I know I'm looking forward to, after this conversation, to listening to another podcast episode from Translash, from Amara Jones, and so I would encourage everybody to do that. Who could you learn about maybe this month, and lift them up and share that with the people in your lives and in your circles. So, Pheng, I was going to say, if you have any final thoughts, feel free to share that, and then I can wrap us up.
I don't. I really, again, appreciate this conversation. And for those who are joining us, definitely, I think my thing is really think about your relationship to femininity and femme characteristics and what that means.
Awesome. Well, I will be doing that for sure. Hold me accountable, Pheng, next time we talk. And we also, of course, always want to share gratitude and thank our funding partners, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, as well as the Novo Foundation, for all of their support and partnership with these conversations. And as a reminder, we hold these conversations every other Thursday at noon Central Standard Time. So 2 weeks from now, on March 24th, we will be back live, and actually that will be a special live episode that we'll be holding, because that is when we will be hosting our 2-day statewide summit next time. So March 24th, we will be coming live from the summit to share a little bit about what's going on as we're in that space together, and also possibly sharing some practices with all of you. So we hope that you will join us in 2 weeks for that. And don't forget, before you click out of here, like our Facebook page. You can find us on YouTube to find all of our previous conversations that are amazing. I highly recommend. Check those out. And again, we just want to say thank you for joining us in this time, and take care until next time.
Here.